He signed his own name into obsolescence and did not fully understand it until years later. A queen packed a suitcase while the flag she had lived under was already coming down outside. A boy was told, in a language not his own, that the throne he had been raised for did not exist anymore. This is not a story about kings who slowly faded. This is a story about families who went to sleep as royalty and woke up as strangers. Sometimes a signature did it, sometimes a mob, sometimes a single vote. 10 families, 10 crowns, and the exact night each of them stopped being royal. Number 10 begins in Rome on a summer morning in 1946 with a man boarding a plane at Ciampino Airport. His name was Umberto II, and he had been King of Italy for exactly 34 days. They called him the King of May. It was not a compliment. His father, Victor Emmanuel III, had spent the war shaking hands with Mussolini, standing on balconies, signing decrees, and lending the crown of the House of Savoy to a regime that had led Italy into humiliation. By the time Victor Emmanuel understood the damage, it was too late. He abdicated in favor of his son, hoping a fresh face might save the dynasty. It did not. On the 2nd of June 1946, Italy voted. It was not a coup. It was a referendum, printed on paper, counted in polling stations, certified by a court. 54% chose the Republic. Umberto had reigned less than 5 weeks. He was already history. He left 11 days later. He flew to Portugal. He settled in Cascais, a coastal town where exiled monarchs often ended up. He never came back. The most striking part was not the vote. It was the paperwork that followed. When the new Italian constitution was written, Article 13 was added to the transitional provisions. The male heirs of the House of Savoy were forbidden from setting foot on Italian soil, indefinitely. A country wrote into its founding document that a specific family could not come home. Umberto lived in Cascais for the rest of his life. He kept court, in a way. Visitors arrived. Old officers bowed. He died in Geneva in 1983, having never returned to Italy. His son, Vittorio Emanuele, was forced to wait 56 years. In 2002, the Italian parliament amended the constitution. Vittorio Emanuele finally set foot on Italian soil, escorted by cameras, decades after his father had been buried far away. Then history did something cruel. In 2006, he was arrested in an Italian corruption investigation involving an illegal gambling ring. The former heir to the throne was photographed being led through a police station in a country that had only recently permitted his existence within its borders. The Savoy Cross still stares out from old buildings, old street corners, old military monuments. The mailboxes in some parts of the country still carry the emblem of a dynasty that made modern Italy. Italy still wears the family's fingerprints on its buildings. It just no longer lets them through the door. But Umberto at least knew the country that rejected him. The next king was told his country no longer existed at all. Number 9 begins in Belgrade, but ends in Denver, Colorado. Peter II, Karađorđević, was crowned King of Yugoslavia at age 11. His father, Alexander III, had just been assassinated in Marseille in 1934. Peter grew up in a palace with a crown he had inherited before he was old enough to shave. Yugoslavia was a country stitched together from Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosnians, Macedonians, and Montenegrins, held together by his family and the Orthodox faith of the Karađorđević line. The dream did not survive World War II. In April 1941, Germany invaded Yugoslavia. Peter fled at 17. He escaped to Greece, then Egypt, and eventually London, where he spent the war as a young monarch in exile. He gave BBC speeches. He waited to go home. He never did. Josip Broz. Tito's partisans fought their way to victory. In November 1945, the Constituent Assembly formally abolished the monarchy and proclaimed the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia. Peter learned his throne was gone from newspapers. He was still calling himself king. His kingdom had just been renamed, rewritten, and reflagged without asking him. The rest of his life was a long unwinding. He tried business. He failed. He drank. He moved from London to Paris to Chicago to Los Angeles to Denver. He was photographed in restaurants and bars in ordinary suits. Old émigrés would recognize him and kiss his hand. Most Americans did not know who he was. He died in Denver in 1970. He was 47. Because no European country would allow him to be buried in soil that mattered, he was interred in a Serbian Orthodox monastery in Libertyville, Illinois. He was the only European monarch buried on American soil at the time. In 2013, decades after his death, Serbia agreed to bring him home. Peter II was reburied at the Karađorđević family mausoleum in Oplenac. His son Alexander later moved to Belgrade and now lives in a wing of the old royal residence as a private citizen. The country Peter was raised to unify did not just reject him. It later disappeared entirely, splitting into 7 separate states through the wars of the 1990s. He outlived his crown. His kingdom outlived neither of them. He died in Denver. Yugoslavia died in the 1990s. Neither one had a throne to sit on by the end. Peter lost his crown to a war. The next king lost his to a speech in a beer hall. Number 8 belongs to the House of Wittelsbachs, and it ended on a Thursday in Munich in November 1918 in a room full of beer glasses. The king was not even invited. The Wittelsbachs had ruled Bavaria since 1180, 738 years, longer than most countries have existed. Their palace, the residence in Munich, held collections that took generations to assemble. Their crest, the blue and white lozenge, was stitched into every corner of Bavarian identity. King Ludwig III was 73 years old. He was the last Wittelsbach to sit on the Bavarian throne, and he did not know it yet. Germany was losing the First World War. The Kaiser in Berlin was collapsing. Sailors had mutinied in Kiel. In Munich, a Jewish socialist journalist named Kurt Eisner led a march that turned into a takeover. On the night of November 7, 1918, Bavarian soldiers refused to defend the palace. Ludwig fled. He walked out of the residence through the gardens with his family, reportedly carrying a small suitcase and a box of cigars. That same night, Kurt Eisner stood in a Munich beer hall and proclaimed the Free State of Bavaria. 738 years of dynasty ended in a proclamation from a room where working men drank. 6 days later, in Anif, Ludwig signed a declaration releasing his officials and officers from their oath of loyalty. He was careful not to call it an abdication. Politically, it did not matter. The monarchy was gone. Ludwig died in Hungary in 1921. His son, Ruprecht, technically became head of the house but never sat on any throne. The Wittelsbachs kept some private property. The current head of the family, Franz, is a great-grandson who has lived in Nymphenburg Palace as a private tenant of his own ancestors' home. The strange surviving trace is on the flag. The blue and white lozenge pattern of the Wittelsbach coat of arms became the flag of the modern state of Bavaria. The country kept the family's symbol and dropped the family. Every day, over the parliament building that abolished the monarchy, the family crest flies. 738 years of rule ended between dinner and breakfast. The next morning, Bavaria had a new government. The Wittelsbachs had cigars, a suitcase, and a very long walk. Number 7 begins with an emperor at the beach. Pedro II of Brazil was one of the most cultured monarchs of the 19th century. He corresponded with Charles Darwin. He met Louis Pasteur. He read Victor Hugo in French. Foreign visitors called him the philosopher king. He had reigned for 58 years, since he was 14. The crack under the marble was slavery. In May 1888, while Pedro was abroad in Europe recovering his health, his daughter Isabel signed the Lei Aurea, the Golden Law, abolishing slavery in Brazil. Overnight, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people were freed. The world applauded. The Brazilian plantation aristocracy, which had propped up the throne for generations, did not. The military resented budget cuts. The Republicans smelled blood. The people who had defended the crown decided they no longer would. On the morning of November 15, 1889, Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca led troops into the streets of Rio. Pedro was at his summer residence in Petropolis. When he arrived at the city palace, he was informed that the monarchy had ended. There were no shots. There was a document. The imperial family was told to leave Brazilian soil. Within days, they were on a merchant ship, not a state vessel, bound for Europe. Pedro refused the pension the new republic offered him. His wife, the Empress Teresa Cristina, died 3 weeks later in Portugal. Pedro moved to Paris. He lived in a hotel. The former Emperor of Brazil, who had received presidents and prime ministers, spent his last years in rented rooms in the Hotel Bedford. He died there in December 1891. According to accounts published after his death, his family found a small package of Brazilian soil beneath his pillow. It was the only piece of the country he had ruled that he could take to the grave. In 1922, 33 years after being told to leave, Pedro's body was brought back. A state funeral was held. By then, most of the Brazilians who watched the coffin pass had never called him emperor in their lives. He freed the enslaved and lost his country in the same year. It took Brazil 33 years to bring him home. By then, no one there had ever called him emperor. Number 6 is the German Kaiser, and his fall is one of the strangest in modern royal history because it happened without him. Wilhelm II was the grandson of Queen Victoria, cousin to King George I of Britain and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. He had ruled the German Empire since 1888. He owned palaces, castles, the imperial railway carriage, an army, a navy, and a self-image the size of a continent. Then came the First World War. By late 1918, Germany was finished. The navy mutinied at Kiel. Sailors and soldiers formed councils. The Kaiser was at military headquarters in Spa, Belgium. He still believed he could lead loyal troops back to crush the uprising. On November 9, 1918, Chancellor Max von Baden was in Berlin. Without waiting for the Kaiser's consent, he publicly announced Wilhelm's abdication. Hours later, the Social Democrat Philipp Scheidemann proclaimed a republic from a window of the Reichstag to preempt the communists proclaiming a socialist one. Wilhelm had not agreed to any of it. He turned to his generals. He asked them if the army would follow him back to Germany. Field Marshal Wilhelm Groener told him the truth. The army would march home. It would not march for him. That afternoon, the Kaiser boarded a train. He crossed into the neutral Netherlands the next morning. Queen Wilhelmina granted him asylum. His formal abdication document was signed on November 28th. By then, he had already been an ex-Kaiser for 19 days. Wilhelm bought a manor called Hohenzollerns. He spent the rest of his life there. He chopped wood. He wrote memoirs full of grievance. When Hitler invaded the Netherlands in 1940, Wilhelm was still there. Hitler offered to bring him home. Wilhelm refused. He would return only as Kaiser, or not at all. He died at Hohenzollerns on June 4, 1941, at 82. He left instructions that his body was not to return to Germany until the monarchy was restored. The monarchy has not been restored. He is still buried in the Netherlands. The strange surviving trace is the woodpile. Photographs from Hohenzollerns show Wilhelm in civilian clothes, sleeves rolled, cutting logs. Over the decades, his gardeners piled the wood into enormous stacks. Some of those stacks are still there. A Kaiser reduced to a hobby. Number 5 is the House of Habsburg. 640 years of Central European power, ended in a treaty, then finished off by a law. The Habsburgs had ruled Austria since 1282. Marie Antoinette was a Habsburg. So was the woman who married Napoleon. Their empire in 1914 stretched across what is now Austria, Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, parts of Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia. Over 50 million people, a dozen languages, a double-headed eagle on every coin. The last emperor was Karl IV. He inherited the throne in 1916 during a war he had not started and could not end. He tried. He proposed federalizing the empire. Every effort came too late. In October and November 1918, the empire dissolved not through conquest, but through internal secession. Czechs declared independence. Hungarians declared independence. South Slavs joined a new kingdom. Poles reformed a state. The map of Central Europe redrew itself in 6 weeks. On November 11, 1918, Karl signed a document renouncing participation in state affairs. He was careful not to call it an abdication. The Austrian Republic was proclaimed the next day. Then came the Habsburg Law of April 3, 1919. The new republic decided that renunciation was not enough. The law exiled the family from Austrian territory. It confiscated their property. It stated that any member of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine who wished to return must formally renounce all dynastic claims and any Habsburg identity. A family name became a legal obstacle to being Austrian. Karl and his wife Zita went into exile in Switzerland. In 1921, they attempted 2 failed restorations in Hungary. Karl was arrested and shipped to the Portuguese island of Madeira aboard a British warship. He died there in April 1922 of pneumonia in a small rented house. He was 34. Zita was 29, pregnant with their 8th child. She lived in exile for another 67 years. She wore black every day. She outlived 9 popes. Their eldest son, Otto, could not enter Austria until 1966 after formally renouncing the throne. Karl was beatified by the Catholic Church in 2004. The empire ended in November. The name ended in April. A family that had ruled for 640 years learned it could be legislated out of existence in 6 months. Number 4 happened in slow motion. Inside a palace the emperor was allowed to keep. Puyi became Emperor of China in December 1908 at the age of 2. He was carried onto the dragon throne, screaming. The Qing dynasty had ruled China since 1644. It ruled a country of 400 million people and the Forbidden City with its 980 buildings. It lasted 3 more years. The 1911 Xinhai Revolution swept the country. On February 12, 1912, the Empress Dowager Long Yu signed the Articles of Favorable Treatment. Puyi abdicated. He was 6 years old, but the articles allowed him to keep the imperial title. He kept the Forbidden City. He kept his eunuchs. He kept an annual subsidy from the new republic. Outside the palace walls, China was a republic. Inside them, he was still addressed as Your Majesty. He was an emperor of one building. This continued for 12 years. Puyi grew up as a ghost king. A Scottish tutor named Reginald Johnston taught him English and gave him the name Henry. He learned to ride a bicycle in courtyards where his ancestors had held audiences. Outside, warlords fought over the country. Inside, servants still knelt. The end came in November 1924. The warlord, Feng Yuxiang, seized Beijing. He decided the arrangement was absurd. His troops surrounded the Forbidden City. Puyi was given 3 hours to pack. He left in a car. He was 18. The palace behind him became the Palace Museum. What followed was one of the strangest lives of the 20th century. Puyi fled to the Japanese concession in Tianjin. In 1934, the Japanese installed him as puppet emperor of Manchukuo. He was an emperor again, of a country that existed only because a foreign army said so. When Japan lost the war in 1945, Puyi was captured by Soviet troops. He spent 5 years in a Soviet prison. He was handed to the Chinese communists in 1950. He spent another decade in a re-education prison in Fushun. He was released in 1959. Mao's government gave him a job. He worked as a gardener at the Beijing Botanical Gardens. He later became an archivist. He married a nurse. He died of kidney cancer in 1967 in a small apartment in Beijing. The strange surviving trace is his citizen's ID card. An emperor of 400 million people ended his life carrying an ordinary identity document. His childhood bedroom in the Forbidden City is walked through by millions of tourists every year. Most do not know which room was his. Number 3 is Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, and the speed of his collapse is still difficult to absorb. In January 1979, he owned an empire built on the world's 3rd largest proven oil reserves. He owned the Peacock Throne, the Niavaran Palace, jewels that filled museum vaults. In 1971, he had thrown a party at Persepolis to celebrate 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. It was called the most expensive party in history. By July 1980, he was dead in a Cairo hospital, a stateless cancer patient nobody had wanted to admit. His secret police, Savak, had crushed opposition. His white revolution had modernized the country, but alienated the clergy, the merchants, and the students. Ayatollah Khomeini broadcast sermons from exile in Paris on cassette tapes that spread through the bazaars. The Shah was hiding something. He had non-Hodgkin lymphoma, treated in secret by French doctors. In 1978, strikes paralyzed the oil industry. Millions marched. American support wavered. On January 16, 1979, the Shah left Tehran. Officially, he was going on vacation. He never returned. Khomeini flew back on February 1st. 10 days later, the Pahlavi state collapsed. What followed was one of the most humiliating exiles of any modern monarch. Egypt took him first, then Morocco, then the Bahamas, then Mexico. When the United States admitted him for medical treatment, Iranian students seized the American embassy in Tehran and held 52 hostages for 444 days. Under pressure, the Shah left the United States for Panama, then returned to Egypt. Anwar Sadat gave him a home when no one else would. He died in Cairo on July 27, 1980. He was buried at the Al-Rifa'i Mosque next to King Farouk of Egypt, another exiled monarch. The strange surviving trace is the jewels. The crown jewels of Iran, worth billions, still sit in a vault beneath the Central Bank of Iran. The Islamic Republic owns them now. They back the currency. Every rial in circulation is guaranteed by objects the Pahlavis once wore. He owned 2,500 years of history in January. In July, he owned a hospital bed in Cairo. The jewels stayed in Tehran. He didn't. Number 2 is the Romanovs, and their story is the archetype of every royal collapse. In March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II was the anointed ruler of 1/6 of the earth. He commanded the world's largest army. He held the Winter Palace, Tsarskoye Selo, Livadia, in Crimea. His family owned Fabergé eggs. His wife Alexandra was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. The First World War destroyed all of it in 3 years. Nicholas insisted on personally commanding the army at the front. Every defeat became his defeat. In Petrograd, bread lines lengthened. Rasputin's influence poisoned what remained of the monarchy's reputation. When bread riots broke out in February 1917, soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. Nicholas's own generals told him he had to go. On March 15, 1917, in a railway carriage at Pskov, he signed the abdication. He renounced the throne for himself, and then, unusually, for his son as well, because he could not bear to leave the boy behind. His brother Michael declined the throne the next day. 3 centuries of Romanov rule ended in 48 hours, on trains. The family was placed under house arrest at Tsarskoye Selo, then moved to Tobolsk in Siberia. Then, after the October Revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power, moved again to Yekaterinburg. They were held in a merchant's house that their captors called the House of Special Purpose. On the night of July 16-17, 1918, the family was taken to the basement. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 servants were shot. The bodies were hidden. The fate of the children was denied for decades. The Ipatiev house was demolished in 1977 on orders of a local party official named Boris Yeltsin. In 1998, verified remains of most of the family were reburied in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. In 2000, Nicholas and his family were canonized as saints by the Russian Orthodox Church. On the site of the basement now stands the Church on the Blood, one of the largest Orthodox cathedrals in Russia. The regime that killed the Romanovs for representing tyranny lasted 74 years. The family it murdered are now saints. Russia rehabilitated them legally in 2008. The state that killed them apologized to them. The Bolsheviks lasted 74 years. The Romanovs became saints. The basement is a church now. The only monarchy left in that story is the one they killed. The Romanovs fell in a basement. The last family in our story fell in a car, and the car was smaller than the man inside it. Number 1 is Haile Selassie, and the image left behind is the smallest, saddest object on this entire list. He was the 225th monarch in a line that claimed descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. 3,000 years, by tradition. His full title read, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, Elect of God. He addressed the League of Nations in 1936, warning the world about fascism. In Jamaica, the Rastafari movement worshipped him as divine. By 1974, he was 82. He lived in the Jubilee Palace in Addis Ababa. He kept pet lions. His court was a world of aristocrats and rituals designed to look eternal. Under the surface, Ethiopia was in crisis. A catastrophic famine in Wallo was killing hundreds of thousands. The government had hidden it. A BBC documentary called The Unknown Famine juxtaposed footage of starving villagers with palace footage of the emperor feeding his dogs. That documentary killed the monarchy. A committee of junior military officers called the Derg began moving. Over months, they arrested ministers, then the imperial family, then the aristocracy. They dismantled the state around Selassie while leaving him nominally in place. On September 12, 1974, they arrived at the Jubilee Palace. They read a communique deposing him. They drove him away. The car was a light blue Volkswagen Beetle. The emperor, who had been treated as descended from Solomon, was being taken to prison in a compact car. He reportedly complained. It didn't matter. He was held in a small room in the same palace where he had once received presidents. He died on August 27, 1975. Officially, the cause was respiratory failure. Independent historians and later Ethiopian investigations concluded he was almost certainly killed on the orders of Derg leader Mengistu Haile Mariam. His body was buried under a toilet floor in the palace, an act of deliberate humiliation. It was discovered in 1992 after the fall of the Derg. His remains were given a state funeral in 2000. The strange surviving trace is the photograph. A picture of the emperor being driven away in that Volkswagen became one of the 20th century's most quietly devastating images. In Jamaica, the Rastafari still say he never truly died. The 3,000-year Solomonic line, one of the oldest continuous monarchies in human history, ended in a compact car. The man who founded the Organization of African Unity was buried under a bathroom by the men who replaced him. The Derg lasted 17 years. He outlives them in memory. 3,000 years of dynasty ended in a Volkswagen. Kings need armies. Emperors need myths. He had both, until one Thursday morning when he had neither. The palace is now a museum. The Beetle is somewhere in a garage. And in Jamaica, they still say he never died at all. 10 families, 10 crowns, 10 different ways of losing a country. Some fell to votes, some to soldiers, some to signatures on paper written by men who had never worn a uniform. What connects them is not the size of the empire or the age of the dynasty. It is how quickly a shared belief can end. Monarchy is a story a country tells itself. The palace is real. The flag is real. The coins are real. But the power behind them is a kind of collective agreement, and collective agreements can be withdrawn overnight. When they are, the physical things remain. The palaces become museums. The crests stay on the mailboxes. The jewels sit in vaults owned by governments that overthrew the families who once wore them. The graves remain in foreign cemeteries. They all went to bed one night, believing the crown was theirs. And then a signature, or a soldier, or a vote decided otherwise. The strangest thing about royalty is not how it begins. It is how quickly it can end.